appeal of Joe Biden's message to some voters is, well, he's saying to me this is not going to be that hard. But when in reality, it actually is going to be that hard if we want to actually do something to actually fundamentally change things.
Seems like there are two kinds of Biden stands that I've sort of come in contact with, like an offensive and a defensive. Like there are people who think that Biden is, the safest, most risk-averse way to get a Democrat in the office, which I argue against. I would say I don't think he's actually a very strong contender, and I don't think he could particularly win. And then there's like kind of like there's a legitimate pro-Biden. They're like, no, it's great. He's associated with this Obama administration. Like he has all the sort of aesthetics of progressivism that he just sort of inherited from, an 8-year period where he did God knows what. And to that, I'd argue that those policies, which are terrible, and I've got a big old list of policies that I think average people would be disgusted by in an article that I'll post with the episode. Those policies are what got us Trump. So it's neither good offense nor defense to go for Biden.
I think what they like, the defensive Biden thing, it's a delusion, and it's the same one that powered Clinton, which is in a respect, and only it's more explicit about it because he was actually in the Obama administration for both times. He was on the ticket twice. Is if you get Biden in there, you just all the people who voted for Obama, they'll just vote for them,
right?
And it'll just be
That's
recreating the Obama,
thing,
the Obama coalition,
which is silly and won't happen.
Even though we learned into 2016 that the thing about the Obama coalition is it was led by Barack Obama. He was a once in a generation political talent, and people just liked him.
Yeah,
it's hard to remember because you've got this rump of maniacs who believed that he was, a Sharia zombie dog eater or whatever the hell. But he was just like people. No matter what the policies were, people were just like, I think that he's a good guy.
Yeah,
And there's none of that shine off of any of the people surrounding him.
Well, and there's also this sense that politicians can kind of hand over their support that's inherently flawed. People always said that about, like, I wrote a criticism of this. Hamilton Nolan said that, like, Bernie should hand over his supporters. It's like, well, if he was able to do that, then Hillary would have won the first time around.
Yeah.
You can't actually exchange your supporters. They're people with opinions and values, and they're not just going to follow anyone because they're in the same tent. Like, leadership and policies do matter.
And I think with Biden, to your point, I mean, I think whether it's him or another candidate, it's that the Democrats have sort of either forgotten or not realized that risk aversion is a risk unto itself.
Yeah.
Like,
most dangerous thing a girl like you can do is play it safe, Bernie.
Right. I mean, I just think it's like Joe Biden is risk averse, or is a risk averse choice on paper, but that's not actually proven out. That in fact, if you could make an equally strong argument that Joe Biden has run for president twice before and not done very well. So why are we calling him a risk averse choice?
Right.
And I think,
and let's think about let's say he could get elected, which I'm very not sure of. What president would come after a President Joe Biden? It would be Trump again, but like, I don't know, some weird mutant clone. Like,
it's his head in a jar.
Yeah.
With like a hoverboard under it. Yeah.
It would be the Nixon head in a jar from Futurama. Yeah. One of the things that I do encounter, only from a small number of people, but I live in New York, unfortunately, but you do hear people say they're sick of old white men. Which, whatever, fair. And a lot of dust up has been made about that online. I think we all know that Bernie's the best candidate for anyone who isn't an old white man. So I guess what would be your wording to convey that to a skeptic?
Well, first of all, I mean, the polling data that we have shows that Bernie has a very strong support among people of color. So I think that there's a disconnect between the discourse casting Bernie only as an old white man.
It's almost like there's an elite liberal media that actually values things that don't reflect the larger American population.
It really is almost like that. But that his coalition is, if you look at it, and I'm just talking about the data here, that his coalition is a coalition of all different sorts of people of color, women. I mean, it's a very diverse coalition. And I think, look, clearly the the idea of white men being overrepresented in our politics, I think that is a real thing that has obviously happened. I think, though, you have to look at the election as we are electing, when we choose a president, we're electing a set of values and a set of policies. And so what are these policies actually going to do? And I think, if you look at Bernie's agenda, right, you look at Medicare for all and how there are disproportionately high rates of uninsurance in communities of color. If you look at the $15 minimum wage, what is it? I think it's 1 in 3 African-American workers would get a raise from a $15 minimum wage. So I think if you go down the list of policies and ask, who do these policies serve? I mean, the policies serve, frankly, the 99% that's been ignored by the current policies, and that because of things like the racial wealth gap and the like, that those policies would, in many cases, disproportionately boost and support communities of color. And I think Bernie has noted that, and he has made that clear, and he continues to make that clear in his speeches and in his presentation of this agenda. And I think, look, people have to ultimately, when they decide who to vote for, it goes back to, do you think you're voting only for the candidate as a person, or do you think you are part of a movement and a set of policies that will be ultimately enacted? And that's to me, I mean, he basically, I mean, that's the theory of his campaign, right? The whole motto of the campaign is not me, us. And he really believes it.
I also just don't think people need to get that tripped up on this stuff. Like, it's one of these things that gets brought up over and over again, like ad nauseum, by the sort of chattering Twitter classes or whatever. But ultimately, people don't care that much. I mean, it's very much a subject for the discourse, which is really separate from all of this other stuff. So I do think it's worth it to say, look, Bernie is the best candidate for people of color. Bernie is the best candidate for women. Bernie's the best candidate for the elderly, certainly for anyone working, and for X, Y, and Z. But my advice is generally to people, whatever, knocking on doors, is I wouldn't get too worried about someone who says that to you, because one, they're sort of in a minority, and two, I don't really know if people really believe that themselves.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I think
if you care about policy, you end up in the right place.
Right. I mean, and I think that he has made this point that look, there are specific issues that are that specifically affect communities of color. I mean, the criminal justice system is institutionally racist. These are, he's not somebody who says that, there's only a class-based agenda and there's no such thing as racism. I mean, he has spoken a lot about the intertwining nature of...
Yeah, you might actually have a little bit of a history with anti-racist activism.
Exactly. But the bottom line is that he also says that, look, the economic crisis, the wage crisis, all of these crises, they hit all sorts of different communities in all sorts of acute ways.
Mm-hmm. What about all the anyone but Bernie coming from, think tanks and sort of right liberal media and certainly big money? That might seem like an obstacle to some people. Why is it anyone but Bernie? First of all,
so I have a theory about this. So the anybody but Bernie, at one level, it's ideological. It's Bernie is separate and presents a separate agenda from, they have overlapping policies, but he is a separate agenda from basically all of the other candidates. The way his theory of power, his theory of change, the agenda he's actually pushing. But I also think there's a personal aspect to this. Mm-hmm. That let's remember that a lot of the anybody but Bernie noise that comes out of Washington comes out of think tanks and organizations and individuals whose entire career and relevance are staked on electing somebody that they have a connection to. Mm. That if you're a think tank and you want to influence the next president of the United States, their administration, if you're somebody at a think tank and you want to be the deputy secretary of whatever, the problem that a Bernie Sanders candidacy presents to you is that Bernie Sanders is, not that he has no allies in Washington, but clearly he is not part of that Washington blob. Like, you are not necessarily 2 or 1 degree of separation from getting that job or from being able to influence a Bernie Sanders administration. And so the hostility to a potential Bernie candidacy is intensified by the fact that on top of the ideological difference that you have with him and his agenda, it's like, what are you going to do in a Bernie Sanders administration if you're at a Wall Street think tank whose job is to infiltrate the Democratic Party? I mean, how much influence? You're basically not going to have any influence at all. So he is a mortal existential threat to you.
Bernie is not going to be consulting third way.
Exactly.
But I think with the response from a lot of people, and I mean, obviously it's cynical at the top level, but there are this group of liberal voters who presumably have good faith, some of them anyway, and who have internalized the idea, the West Wing notion of wonkery as its own good, and of the idea that policies should be inherently complicated or compromisable, because that's how you get things done. And they will say, yeah, you're not going to have any of us in the administration. They're not going to have any of these people who know how it works in the administration. And so that means that when Bernie gets in there with his big, broad policies that don't have the specifics, that don't have the mechanisms that can allow for the sort of savvy horse trading that allows for policies to get actually enacted, that he's going to get in there and there's not going to be any.
So basically, if you don't let third way own your policy, then you're not going to ever be able to get anything done.
Right.
So I think the response to that is basically that it's not that Bernie Sanders doesn't want to work with anyone. It's that the players that he wants to work with are fundamentally different. Example, my guess is there would be no one who is in a stronger partnership, no president who would have been in a stronger partnership with the labor movement than Bernie Sanders.
Yep.
I think Bernie Sanders will have very strong relationships with the environmental movement. But that is separate and distinct from, and those are grassroots organizations. That's separate and distinct from these essentially corporate front groups, corporate-funded think tanks that exist essentially at best to maintain the status quo, and really, in many cases, to perpetuate, really bad corporatist policies. And what he's saying is that's actually not going to be part of something that infiltrates my administration. And so when you look at the anybody but Bernie crowd, typically it is that particular crowd. It's not, most of, if not all of the labor movement. It's not environmental groups. It's 2 degrees, 1 degree of separation from the pharmaceutical industry, Wall Street, the corporate forces that are against his candidacy inherently.
Right. And I think another thing that, like what Matt said about like this idea of like they're the clever, reasonable guys in the room, you don't understand how this stuff operates. Like a lot of these sort of think tanks and liberal technocrats really benefit from disseminating a culture of obscurantism around just politics and funding and all manner of things.